Welcome, everybody, to Inside the Church. This is Jacob Nelson again, Director of Formation at St. Charles Borromeo, and we're broadcasting from my office right now. Part of the Inside the Church series is going to be not just about the facilities here at St. Charles and literally going inside of St. Charles Borromeo Church, but also digging inside the church on her teachings. And I thought a great place to start would be on the sacraments, baptism, confession, Eucharist in particular. I want to focus on for various reasons, but we'll go through all 7 sacraments eventually. But this video I wanted to do as an introduction to the sacraments, particularly for confession, but also an introduction to morality, since morality has to do so much with our confessions, of course, and our spiritual lives. And so I thought I would just begin with understanding the human person. We can't understand really the workings of God in our life and the sacraments and the church without really understanding the human person. And this is something that's so often lost in our world today. We don't consider the construction of the human person. We so often just think of us as a body and with a soul in the Judeo-Christian tradition. But we never really contemplate, if you will, what the soul is constructed of or how it's formulated. And traditionally in the church and her theology, we would consider the soul particularly in 4 parts: the intellect, the will, and the 2 passions, irascible and concupiscible. We can also talk about things like the 5 external senses and the 4 internal senses. We're all familiar with things like sight and smell, but we actually have 4 internal senses too, which are functions of the soul and the intellect. And so we actually, as humans, have 9 senses, and that's something that we don't often consider. But the first thing I wanted to really focus on is this notion of the intellect and natural law. Many people reject the idea of natural law because for every law, it implies there's a lawgiver. And since we humans can't write laws that direct eagles and rocks and whatever else to act a certain way, it necessarily implies that there's a greater entity outside of those creatures that wrote the law. Thus, we imply that there is a God, in fact, a divine legislator, if you will. And so when we look at natural law, all we really mean in the most basic form is that there's a law that directs a particular nature. And so it's why all eagles know how to fly. It's why all crappies act in similar ways. It's why dogs act in similar ways, and so on and so forth. But where do those laws come from? Why is it that we can distinguish between a dog and a horse and an eagle and a rock and an ant? And the reality is because their natures act for a particular end. Dogs eat a certain way, horses eat a certain way, and so on. They reproduce in certain ways to extend the species. And so all of these creatures act a certain way according to their nature. And likewise, humanity acts a certain way in accordance with its nature and the laws written therein. But just as we look at horses and dogs and other animals and creatures, they act for a certain end, the highest end being the propagation of the species, so they reproduce. But humanity has a higher end, a nobler end, because we have an intellect. We're more than just a body. And so because we have an intellect and that's something that makes us like God, it stands to reason that our proper end, both from the standpoint of revelation, but also just our ability to reason, is that we are naturally oriented towards friendship with God. That's different from the beatific vision and viewing God, which we'll talk about another time. But our intellect directs us towards the good, which ultimately is God. And just in order to keep this short, I just want to touch on one in particular thing about the intellect, that the chief function of the intellect, is to discriminate. And that doesn't mean to hold one group back over another, but discrimination means to choose one over the other. And so you're naturally good at this. You choose one thing over the other because you've decided that one thing is better than the other. You choose steak over McDonald's hamburger, for instance. You choose a certain kind of car or a certain kind of house because for whatever reason you've determined that to be better than the other options. And so naturally the intellect is choosing one over the other, or directing the will to choose. And the intellect orders things according to how good they are, or how we perceive them to be good. And so naturally, we choose a good and better and best. But by extension, if there's a good, then there must be an evil, a reason why we choose one over the other. And whether it's because the best of um, the worst things or the best of the great things, as we begin to choose, as we discriminate, we naturally put things in a hierarchy of natural goods and evils and so on. And so our intellect naturally does this for us. And so as we go into sacraments and morality, and this will be kind of a bifurcation, we'll have a series of videos on the human person and the moral life, and we'll also have a series of videos on the sacraments, and this is kind of the springboard for both of those. But as we look specifically to the sacraments and confession in particular in this case, we start to begin to unravel the way to discern how to make a good confession, the purpose of confession, how to examine one's heart and soul, and to do so with great joy. As St. Francis de Sales would say, virtue is a good, deep-seated habit done easily, quickly, and with joy. And so we want to develop that as we have so much time in our various homes and lives during this lockdown. And so we develop this ability as we have perhaps more silence in our lives. We're less busy and we're faced more with facing ourselves in the mirror, as St. Augustine would speak of, that we have to take the opportunity here to discern well and examine our hearts and souls for the opportunities we have for the sacraments, especially confession. And so we'll go through these things more in depth as we go down the line. If there's things in particular you want me to address in the sacraments that I don't in these shorter clips, please feel free to comment or email me at jnelson@stchb.org. My email is also found in the bulletin of St. Charles Borromeo, as well as on the website stchb.org. And I'm happy to make videos accordingly to answer any questions that might be out there in the parish. But please feel free to reach out as we look at the various sacraments, as we look at the moral life, and we'll touch on some more controversial things too, at least in society. And in case you're watching this with your kids, I'll be sure to offer a warning at the beginning of that video for age sensitivity purposes. Anyway, God bless you, and I look forward to hearing any direction that you have to give.